Okay, everyone, let's get started. Thank you all for making it this far to the final and concluding panel of the inaugural Tobias Center Conference. My name is Stephen Macekura. I'm an assistant professor in the International Studies department here. I'm also a historian by training, which means I cannot resist opening this panel with a historical anecdote to help frame our thinking. Yesterday, for those of you who were here, you will remember, I hope, that Dean Feinstein began his remarks by pointing out the date January 20th, 1949, when President Harry Truman gave his inaugural address, in which he announced that the United States would, for the first time, take it upon itself to aid the development of the so-called underdevelopment world. And as Dean Feinstein mentioned, this was a real watershed in world history and in terms of the history of international development. But I want to suggest that 8 years earlier, there was a far less well-known but equally important event, one that we will talk about a little bit more on this panel, and that in many ways has underscored all of our conversations to this point. In 1941, as World War II raged, the British government struggled to figure out how they were going to pay for the war without sending their economy into a recession. And so as part of discussions within the government about how to plan and budget for fighting the war, they adopted for the first time a brand new metric to measure their economic activity, what they called gross national product, or GNP. The following year, in 1942, the United States would do the same thing as part of President Roosevelt's victory program of rearmament. The economists in the United States who oversaw the implementation of planning based on GNP, a man named Simon Kuznets, would go on to have a very distinguished career as a statistician and would in fact travel around the world, helping other countries measure their economic life in the same way and introduce the use of this new metric to help them think about their national economic life and plan for their development accordingly. In a relatively short time, most of the rest of the world did just that. They began to calculate their economic well-being in terms of gross national product. Just 8 years later, when President Truman gave his inaugural address, what gave the phrase underdeveloped world meaning were newly constructed tables of national income and product for all countries. What made a country developed was its level of GNP per capita, and what made a country underdeveloped was a low level of GNP per capita in relation to the so-called wealthy world. But there's more than meets the eye to this story. For beneath these statistics lie really important, deep, and to this day somewhat unresolved questions. Questions about what to count in calculating GNP, how to count it, how to estimate it, to understand what values should guide our thinking about what to count. For instance, there was a big debate in which this economist, Simon Kuznets, was at the center about whether or not to include government spending in calculations of GNP, because Kuznets was worried that in peacetime, if a government spent a lot of money on armaments and military buildup, it would lead policymakers to think that preparing for war was a good thing to be doing, when Kuznets himself believed that preparing for war and spending lots of money on the military was not useful for understanding and thinking about national welfare. And so this panel, which is going to address the issue not just of GNP, but of metrics in general, I hope we can entertain some of these questions that I think have been endemic to understanding and talking about metrics for development from the start, which is to say, how do we know if we've chosen a wise or useful metric? What values should drive our understanding and our selection of metrics? How can and should we improve data capacity? That is the collection ability to go out and find all the data that we think is necessary. To what extent does our use of metrics constrain us in our thinking and pursuit of development? How do we work through or beyond or around those constraints? Metrics are really useful because they cut to the core of issues of accountability, right? Think of accounting and accountability as one and the same. But who determines which metrics will be used for that accountability? Who has the right to access and produce and use data? They're really important questions of justice and rights beneath these as well. These are very big questions, and we certainly won't answer them all. But we are very lucky that we have a truly distinguished panel of guests here to talk about this. Guests who represent the world of practice, the private sector, the philanthropic sector, and also some of the leading scholars on the study of metrics worldwide. I'm going to introduce them briefly before giving them all about 5 or 10 minutes to give some initial thoughts to these big framing questions. So at the far end of the stage here is Una Osili. Una is an economist who has significant research experience in the fields of household behavior and economic policy. In addition to being a researcher, she is now also the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which is really one of the top schools for the study of philanthropy in the entire country. She also directs the school's extensive research program with many partners, including Bank of America, United Way Worldwide, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA. And very relevant for our purposes, she leads the research and the publication of a series of really important indices and metrics about philanthropic giving, including the Index of Global Philanthropy, Giving USA, and Remittances, and Index of Philanthropic Freedom. And so she speaks both as a researcher and a practitioner in this field. Immediately to her right is Morten Jerven, who is an economic historian currently based at Lund University. Dr. Jerven has published a series of really path-breaking books into the history of economic measurement. Books such as Africa, Why Economists Get It Wrong, Poor Numbers, How We Are Misled by African Development Statistics and What to Do About It, and a couple of really important edited volumes about measurement as well. And he's really one of the foremost experts around the world in the history of economic accounting in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and gets really at sort of nitty-gritty and important details related to data collection and its use over time. Next to Morten on his right is Bernard Funck, who comes to us as a leading practitioner. He is now an independent economic advisor, but he has spent a long and distinguished career at the World Bank before that. He was the global leader for macroeconomics and the director of the Economic and Governance Department for the Arab World at the World Bank. During his career at the bank, he managed, did applied policy research, held and organized policy dialogues, and worked with staff from countries across the world. In his bio, he lists about a dozen of them. I won't read them all here, but if you're interested, you can read that in your packet. Before coming to the World Bank, he worked as an economist in the research department of the Belgian Central Bank and the Belgian Planning Bureau. And so he is someone who has experience working with countries of all income and product levels. And then finally, to his right and to my left is Sameeksha Desai, who is an associate professor at the School of Public Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, and who is now, if I can say so, as of January, will be taking up for a few years a research position at the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City. And so she is someone who is also very much a scholar who has a foot in the policy and philanthropic world as well. Professor Desai's research focuses on entrepreneurship, economic development, and public policy. She has published widely in all sorts of journals. She's truly an interdisciplinary scholar. She's published in journals such as the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and the Journal of Small Business Economics. She's also an affiliated researcher with the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum and the editor of Small Business Economics. So I'm very grateful that all of them are going to be here to share their insights with us today. And to get things started, I think we'll begin with Dr. Osili, who will give a brief presentation on her work related to metrics.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a delight to be here. And I'm so pleased that the last session framed a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about in this panel, which is how do we measure development and what should we be measuring to start with. I'll start on a very personal note. There are many students here in the room, and like many of you, many years ago now, I was a graduate student, and I was interested in remittances, money that migrants send to their families in developing countries, and for the most part. But what I found at that time, there was no data. And when I say no data, I mean no data. No countries were tracking remittances, either on the sending side or on the receiving side. And it was largely off the radar of central banks, the World Bank, international financial institutions, or development agencies. It was missing or absent from the development debate. So I, being a graduate student who didn't know any better at the time, decided to take on this challenge and produce my own data. And to do this, I embarked on a year-long project where I collected data on both the sending and the receiving side. And at the time, it was one of the first studies to actually do this internationally. So I know very well that just because it's not being measured doesn't mean it doesn't count. Because for many families across the world, remittances composed a significant share of income. Remittances were making a difference in terms of poverty, education, health, many other domains that we care about. And I knew this because I grew up in Nigeria, and I personally had carried literally thousands of dollars for families across the Atlantic because there wasn't a way to send the money. There was no Western Union in Nigeria at the time. And I remember being very scared, especially as a graduate student. What if I lose this money? What's going to happen? So I'm very grateful that I had faculty members who believed that, you know what, this is possible. And just because someone isn't tracking it right now doesn't mean it doesn't count today. So fast forward the tape 2 decades later, remittances have been hailed as the new development finance. Central banks are keeping track of it. Development agencies are now incorporating it into their plans. And diasporas are now part of the development conversation. So I'm just kind of encouraging all of you before we get started. As we think about metrics, we want to start with the assumption that just because it hasn't been measured yet doesn't mean it can't be. And just because it isn't measured currently doesn't mean it won't be. So I'll just start with that as kind of inspiration for today's talk. And I'll be talking about 2 indices that take on a new aspect of the development conversation, and that's the role of the private sector, and specifically the role of the philanthropic sector in development. So I'll start by saying it's not our grandfathers, our fathers, or even the development conversation I grew up with. It's a lot more complex. I'm so glad we have so many colleagues from different backgrounds. Today, the private sector is playing a greater role than it ever has. My college roommate worked for the Gates Foundation for many years, and she said when she arrived in many countries, the fact that she worked at the Gates Foundation mattered more than the USAID colleagues, the CEDA colleagues, the colleagues from DFID, whoever it was. So it's no longer just about official development assistance. It's about a wider array of actors, whether that's foreign direct investment, whether that's private philanthropy, NGOs. It's a more complex, but it's also a very different world from the one we grew up in. And in addition to the role of the private sector, I want to stress that we have new models in place. So one very prominent example, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan, you may recall, a couple of years ago founded the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. It's not a foundation. It's not a company. It does 3 things: impact investing, grant making, but also advocacy. So they're doing more than just philanthropy. They're also investing in startups. One of their first investments was in a tech company in Nigeria that actually helped spur investment in education and technology. As you look at this array, you will also note that the diaspora is playing a big role, but it's also about partnerships, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Latin America and Asia. The public and private sector coming together to solve problems. So with this as a backdrop, I want to stress that just measuring what official development assistance partners are doing is simply not going to be enough anymore. We're going to look at things in a more complex way with new sources of data, and also asking ourselves what isn't measured yet, and how can we do a better job of that. As part of this, one of our first projects in this global arena at the Lilly Family School is the Index of Global Philanthropy and Remittances, but also the Index of Philanthropic Freedom, which looks at the ease of actually participating in philanthropy in different parts of the world. You may know about the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. Well, this is actually patterned off of that, but looking at how easy is it to actually transfer money across borders. How difficult is it to start an NGO in any given country? And we currently cover 81 countries, about 75% of the world's population, and where in many countries we're covering the most populous countries in those continents. The next project, which will be launched in 2019, is the Index of Global Philanthropy and Remittances. And this specifically looks at not just US ODA, but also the role of remittances and the role of the private sector. The biggest insight that has emerged from putting together all of these data sources together is a measure that we call total economic engagement, where we look at the role of the US official development flows compared to these other flows. And what you'll see immediately is that official development assistance is only 10%, roughly, or under 10% of total engagement with the rest of the world. The FDI flows are much, much greater. Even remittances exceed, in some cases, official development assistance. This is from the US perspective, but let's flip the script and look at it from a receiving country lens. Let's take Nigeria, an oil-producing country, most populous country in sub-Saharan Africa. Nigeria gets more in remittances than it does in foreign direct investment. That shocked me. I had no idea. And you don't think of Nigeria as a labor-sending country, but in terms of flows, this completely inverts the pyramid. So ODA is not necessarily the biggest kid on the block anymore. And with that, I think it does change the development paradigm and also the conversation. It also highlights the role that US companies, US foundations, and US NGOs are playing in the rest of the world. So this has been really a big, I would say it's been a big shift in our development conversation to start to understand and measure what other private sector flows are about and what impact they're having. In terms of the Index of Philanthropic Freedom, I'll just say very quickly that we measure both the strength of civil society as well as the difficulty or ease of actually giving within a particular country. And I'm very pleased to report that this is one of those things that's very hard to measure, but is very important to measure, because we're seeing that in many parts of the world it's becoming more difficult to actually transfer money, not just for foreign foundations or private sector agents, but even within that country, more scrutiny around private donations. And just to end, I'd like to invite all of you to kind of join this discussion in terms of both of these indices, but also the larger development conversation. How do we add more complexity? In some ways, it's not, as we keep saying, it's not just an official development assistance conversation anymore, and how do we measure these less measurable aspects of development? I'd also like to invite many of you who are interested in the project to feel free to contact me and our team. We'd love to have you involved. I know a few people have already talked to me about this earlier. And just in closing, just say once again, thank you for inviting me to join this conference, and I'm just really excited to be part of the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Osili, for getting us started. I think we'll now jump to Bernard Funck, who will continue with this kind of policymaker practitioner perspective on metrics. Please.
Well, thanks for having me on this panel, Stephen. It's a very indeed exciting and multidisciplinary conversation. My approach, I'm going to approach the question of how to value development from an economist perspective. It's what I am. And as an economist, I start from the presumption that the value of things is the value that people attribute to them until proven otherwise. So valuing development for us is first and foremost an empirical question rather than a normative one. And given that allowing for circumstances, human beings are not that different from each other, whether they live in country X, Y, or Z, even if M is Mali and Z is the US, I suspect we would get the same kinds of answers whether we ask that question in Mali or in the US. So let me ask the question to the room. If you had to put a number on US development over the last 10 years, over the last 20 years, over the last 100 years, what number would you reach for? Well, we don't have the time to have that conversation, but I suspect we'd hear more answer than more than just one answer. So I'd like to. So let's try to make a little more progress in nailing this down. As a first approximation, you ask any elected politician in any of these countries, X, Y, or Z, what is going to make their constituents happy and perhaps secure their re-election. And I'm here speaking under the control of Senator Lugar, who's been very successful as an expert at it. My money is on better pay, more jobs. That's the first thing that people are going to talk about. Now, you multiply better pay by more jobs, and what you get is, grosso modo, the growth rate of GDP. So we were looking for metrics. Here's a rough and ready one. And even better, it correlates pretty well with the measure of life satisfaction that comes to us from the World Value Survey. So we seem to be onto something. Now, everybody in this room knows that there's more to life than income. And indeed, when you drill down beyond this aggregate level to what makes people happy at the individual level, using the same data, you find out that income is much less prominent and other dimensions of well-being come much more to the fore. Health, mental health particularly, it seems, social connections, the quality of the natural and cultural environment, all these factors come much more into play. And actually, in recent years, a whole literature has bloomed that seeks to understand, to explore these other dimensions of well-being. It's to the point that nowadays the UN produces an annual World Happiness Report. The OECD has its own Better Life initiative, supported by guidelines on how to measure subjective well-being. And obviously, this is all welcome. That certainly helps us understand things better. I'll just return to a caveat in my concluding remarks. But before that, let's just note that there's hundreds of points of light leave us open with the question of how does that come together? How do you boil it down to some measure consistent, the single metrics of how people judge their own well-being? And clearly, you cannot add one pay raise plus or multiply an extra year of schooling, deduct 1 more hour of commuting time, just don't, it's apples and oranges. But Peter Klenoff and Chad Jones from Stanford University have just recently come out with a nifty way of actually bringing all these dimensions to a common numeraire and weigh them against each other according to people's own preferences. Now, I'll skip the technicalities because it's complicated. But I'd like to highlight a few findings. One, this broader measure of welfare actually correlates very strongly with GDP. So we're not too far off with our first approximation. But second, the deviations from the regression line are wide enough in many cases as to be of interest. For instance, with better health, greater longevity, more leisure, and greater longevity, many European countries actually come out on par with the US despite a lower level of income. Conversely, at the other end of the range, you have lower income countries faring worse than GDP would suggest because of shorter life expectancy, but actually they're also converging faster because of the rapid progress we are making towards expanding life expectancy. I also would like to mention just an interesting feature, property of that metrics is with that indicator, sustainability becomes a much more salient dimension of welfare as people's welfare as welfare grows, because with greater longevity, people worry about a longer time horizon and also lower discount rates. They give more weight to future, to what's going to happen down the road. So I think this is real progress. Now, obviously, people do not care only about averages. They also care about how these averages are distributed. Be it frankly, out of self-interest. They want to know where they are on that distribution curve, or out of altruism, but these target parts of the population they care about. So the metrics to measure what's going on at different point of the distribution curve are well established, poverty rate, Gini, etc. So I won't talk much about it in these remarks. I would just like to focus on one related but separate dimension, which is that of social mobility. And that social mobility is very important in my view, because my hunch is that it is through social mobility, how better each generation is doing than their parents, that people experience development. And as it happens, it's called the Great Gatsby curve, social mobility is inversely related to inequality. So the more inequality, the less mobility there is. Now, this is a field that has been less researched, mainly for data reasons, but Raj Shetty, again from Stanford, has recently done some fantastic work in this field, documenting, for instance, the fading American dream, that each middle-class generation would fare better than their parents. And had we had the benefit of their research, perhaps we would have been less surprised by the results of recent presidential elections. It's not the only way in which social mobility is important. A relative perception of differences in mobility can be very sensitive, because they bring with them issues of fairness. Who's getting ahead? Who's falling behind? And why? Is it by playing by legitimate rules of the game, or is it by twisting them? Now, things can get even worse, as Albert Hirschman pointed out, if these differences in social mobility can be ascribed, or described at least, in terms of group features. Ethnicity, language, caste, class, family, etc. These guys and us. And that can easily then inflame social conflicts and lead to social strife. And indeed, I suspect that the paucity of data, the lack of understanding of what's happening in those dimensions, has blinded us often to undercurrents that were powerful enough to derail even the best development plans. So that's certainly an area where I personally would welcome more research. Now, in concluding, I'd like to return, as I said, to a caveat about happiness. Happiness researchers like to quote Thomas Jefferson in saying that the care of human life and happiness is the sole legitimate purpose of good government. And that's indeed very well put. And you could say the same thing about development in general. Now, I doubt, however, that when he was talking about happiness, Thomas Jefferson was talking about the pursuit of satisfaction that these researchers measure. Instead, I would suspect that Thomas Jefferson was referring to a deeper and more ancient notion of happiness, going back all the way to Aristotle, which is not to get gratification. For Aristotle, happiness was to flourish, to thrive as a thinking political animal. And that brings us closer to the definition of development that has been put forward by Amartya Sen. Development is freedom, development is broadening broadening capabilities, expanding people's horizon of opportunity, strengthening their agency, the capacity to seize this opportunity. And if it sounds a bit philosophical to you, it's not. Take Exhibit A. Country X has for many years experienced modest but steady income growth, rapidly rising human development indicators, declining poverty, declining inequality. What's not to like? Come 2011, the population rises against tyranny and for justice and dignity, and Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution ignites the Arab Spring. Does it matter for development? You bet it does. Take Exhibit B. So far, other than commodity economies, no country has made it to high income that did not first become a democracy. Because for what we measure are often only the inputs to and the outcomes of development. But development itself rests on deeper societal dynamics, dynamics that bring about opportunity, agency, legitimacy, fairness. How well we measure the latter, those opportunity, et cetera, I'm not sure we can do that very well, but that's what the development job entails. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, historians are usually accused of going too far back and beginning our narratives too early, and so it's a bit of a relief to hear an economist reference Aristotle in remarks. I'll also say, I'll just point out, I counted no fewer than 9 different metrics you mentioned as ways of measuring and thus defining development, from GDP and income level to happiness to levels of social mobility, so forth and so on, which I think indicates just how awash we are today in different ways of thinking about this issue. At this point, I'd like to turn to Professor Desai to offer her thoughts on these questions about metrics.
I'm already mic'd up. Okay. So, and I'll caveat, I'm not an economist and I'm not a historian, so you may like or not like what I have to say, but I initially became very interested in markets as a path to development. And so for me, it was really all about practice, and I was very interested in how can you achieve development? How do you get poor places to start to look like rich places, and how do you get poor people in those places to start to invest and make economic decisions like people in rich places? And I realized a few things very quickly. So the first one is that it's actually not that simple, which we now all know. And it doesn't, that's a realization that comes very quickly. But the other is that we often use data and metrics to our advantage when we should actually be using data and metrics to frame the conversation in a lot of ways, because we make assumptions that we really shouldn't be making. And so I'll give you an example. I study entrepreneurship, so I'm really interested in the creation of new businesses, in the value creation that these new businesses bring about, and then in supply chain expansion, quality improvement, and then ultimately what I'm interested in is jobs. And so if we assume that jobs are the absolute most important thing in a society, and through jobs you get wealth creation, you get investment, you get greater spending on education of children, and you'll see some kind of upcycling. If you have job creation, then you would probably tell me that more startups are the answer, right? I mean, that's sort of where we would go. And so we might then say, all right, let's spend $100 million in a community or in a country to get more people to start businesses, right? But we've made a lot of assumptions here. And in a lot of countries, a lot of low-income, lower middle-income countries in particular, corporate assets can be traced back to a handful, say 15, maybe 20 large families, right? So then we have to ask the question, do we want more people in those families to be starting companies and creating jobs? Or do we want more people outside of those families to be starting companies, right? Because it's much harder for people that don't already have connections and assets and wealth. Then we also want to think about, now what if all the jobs we create are low value creating jobs, right? So we create 500 jobs where the actual value that you get from the jobs is not very high, and there are 500 very low paying jobs, right? Then we're not really sure if we should be spending $100 million on a particular program. So we make a lot of assumptions also about whether or not the value of the jobs is going to be high, whether we're going to get good returns, and whether that's going to create the kind of virtuous circles that we want in a local economy. If we're creating jobs where the companies that are actually hiring those people are owned by people in the dominant families in a country, right? Maybe we want to take a step back and rethink what we're doing, or rethink the type of program that we're investing in. So one of the things that I've really come to respect a lot is the multidimensionality of what it is we're trying to measure. And so it's not necessarily only about jobs, and it's not necessarily only about startups. One of the popular ways to look at entrepreneurship in particular is to look at regulations and the cost of doing business. So if we were to look at a country and say, okay, it takes 58 procedures to start a business, right? And that means basically 58 separate filings or pieces of, or steps to actually get a registered business entity up and running, then we haven't been able to look at corruption. We haven't been able to look at any other sort of informal layers. We haven't been able to look really at the efficiency of those steps. And we haven't been able to look at how that actually impacts people. So there are countries where 75, 80, 85% of the labor market operates informally, right? And so our metrics don't actually really capture what's going on there. And so the multidimensionality question, I think, is really important. We also then want to think about, do we really want a lot of startups, or do we want the good startups? So do we want the kind that are going to create 500 jobs, or do we want 500 different people starting companies, right? We know that a disproportionate amount of growth and amount of job creation actually comes from a small number of startups that we would term high growth firms or high growth startups. And so then when we're talking about where to actually put money from a programming perspective, we're stuck. Do we pursue these at the cost of these, or do we pursue these at the cost of these? And so metrics, I think, are really important because they help us frame the conversation. We need to know about the approximate value of the jobs we're going to create, right? We actually want to know how much that is in Indian rupees or in francs or in pesos. We really actually need to know that. We want to know how many jobs we're going to create. We want to know if those jobs that we're going to create are going to lead to other jobs, and if we think that's going to lead to investment. All of that needs to be measured, and measuring these things is really tricky, right? And so a lot of our bigger indices and our more objective measures of development, things like GDP, things like labor market participation, they're very helpful to sort of set the stage and frame the conversation, but they don't capture a lot of what is going on over here at the micro level. So for me, multidimensionality is really, really key. And then connected to that are two questions. One is, what kind of long-term impact do we want to measure? In development programming, you will frequently get negative returns in the initial years. And so you really want to ask the question, how long is it going to take to get the returns that you want, right? So if you think about a firm is going to invest, say, in research and development, right? Spend a lot of money on product innovation or process innovation, and that's not going to be profitable right away. And so how long do we actually wait to get the kind of results and, you know, the job creation that we want or the supply chain integration that we want? So the long-term question is a question, and then also the quality and the outcome question, right? And again, that ties all back to what is it we actually want to get, and can we measure it? So.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think this, the temporal question is an important one, because we often think of metrics as kind of snapshots of a given point in time that are sort of fixed. And this raises really interesting questions about sort of how to make them work sort of through time, how often we need to go and refresh our data and so forth and so on. So really important topics for us to consider. Okay, so rounding us out in terms of initial comments will be Professor Jerven to give us a bit of historical perspective on these issues.
Thank you. Thank you also for the generous introduction, and thanks to the organizers. Congratulations with the center. Thank you for those who invited me here. I literally wouldn't have been here today without you. But let's go to, you mentioned some dates in your introduction. I want to take us to 7th of April, 2014. It's a Sunday afternoon in Abuja, in Nigeria. The director of statistics, Yemi Kale, takes the podium at the Hilton Hotel. And by the time he's done with his announcement, GDP in Nigeria increased 89%. That Sunday afternoon, Nigeria became the largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa, outjumping South Africa during the press release. But those who are South Africans or cheering for South Africa, don't worry, they have already released new GDP numbers, again overtaking Nigeria. That Sunday afternoon, the sub-Saharan African GDP increased almost 20%. Such is the weight of the Nigerian economy. And many were, of course, surprised about these things, but for those who study the nitty-gritty and the hard part of measuring, on which I count myself one of those, were not surprised. In fact, in 2011, there was the similar confusion in the development community when Ghana doubled their GDP after releasing new GDP numbers, and on the 4th of November 2011, it was a poor country. On the 5th of November 2011, it was a middle-income country. And at that point, I was called by newspapers and others, investment banks as well, saying, is this normal? Is this going to be happening? And I said at that point in 2012, I said, yes, this is to be expected. Just look to Nigeria. And at that point, I estimated or guesstimated that there were about 40 Malawis unaccounted for inside of Nigeria. I got that wrong, unfortunately. It was 58. So we just added 58 Malawis to the Nigerian economy, which previously not accounted for. And that tells you a little bit about the certainty to which you should say GDP growth is 3%, 4%, 200 million below or under that poverty line of $2 a day and so forth. And it's actually, what's actually confusing about this is that these kind of changes, that there's nothing fraudulent about it. We always talk about like lies, damn lies and statistics. Journalists are lazy that way. They can't write about statistics unless it's tampering and lying about it. But actually it is, it is a difficult job to go from having tidy theoretical concepts and then getting about measuring it. It's actually the essence of social sciences, deciding what to put in what drawer and what not to put in that drawer. And measurement is it's the central part of that. And it's also, I think, also highlighted some confusions about people having data users, for instance. When the Nigerian GDP statistics were released, everyone just then turned around to the IMF and World Bank and asked them, do you endorse the numbers? It's a grave misunderstanding. IMF and the World Bank does not endorse or not endorse numbers. It's official statistics coming out of Nigeria. It's just because social scientists, journalists, and so forth have this idea that I wouldn't dare of quoting statistics from Sudan because I don't trust that country, but if it's been circulated by the IMF, it's the very same number, it's in the IMF database, then I can use it. It's of course normal that we think that way. No one would take a sip of a random bottle with some brown water in it. But if it says Coca-Cola on it, it's, yeah, I'll have a swig of that. And that's what you're doing when you're running regressions with downloaded data from the World Bank, I would argue. For good and worse, it depends on whether you like Coke or not. But, and so it is, and it is even uncertainty about the kind of, I think people don't realize how, so what's happened in Nigeria is basically they updated the baseline for how to measure their economy. In 2014, they hadn't updated the benchmark year for how to measure GDP since 1990. So a quarter of a century had passed since there were a reasonable snapshot of the Nigerian economy. Of course, lots of things changed in 25 years, so there's nothing unreasonable about it. Nigeria was very well, where we might have been surprised in Washington. In Nigeria, they knew about it. Yemi Kali knew about it. They've been worrying about estimating this GDP for a while. They were hoping to release the numbers as early as 2011, but then the then Indian consultant who was to come down to say, okay, the input-output supply table is now okay, and you can go ahead and release the numbers, unfortunately slipped on a banana peel while changing planes in Dubai, twisted his ankle and had to return to India, and then the IMF had to find a new consultant. It took them a while. A Finnish guy came down eventually in 2013, and voila, we have increased GDP in sub-Saharan Africa of 20%. It is stunning to think about that sub-Saharan African GDP was 20% lower than it should have been 3 years because of a banana peel in Dubai. But that's, we think we see this like tidy, fact sheet, downloadable, objectable, comparable fact that no, it's difficult doing this. But if it is, and that should, we start thinking about that. If it's, I mean, GDP is simple. We have a theory, well established, no one contests that. It's measured by money, dollars and cents, recorded economic activity. That's all you got to do. Yet that is hard. And then you start thinking about happiness or human rights or other things and how difficult it is to get data. GDP comes from the administrative data system of things. But other types of data we often use a lot is survey data. And particularly for poor countries. If I wanted to know how many pupils were enrolled in primary school in Norway yesterday, I could just, the Ministry of Education can punch a button on his computer and he'll get the exact number. And we can match it directly with the registry of kids born in that year. And we would even know if some guy showed up in the morning and then didn't come back after recess. You know, so, but if you asked in Tanzania the same thing, okay, what you got to do, you have to have a survey. Okay, you have to have a survey. So first you have to find $2 million. Yeah? So you get $2 million, you hired 5 experts in Washington, fly down to Dar es Salaam, who get in touch with 5 experts there, who then hire 2,000 students, undergraduate, graduate students, who then go to the population census, hopes it's good enough, then goes to villages, then go and ask, did your son and daughter go to school yesterday? Then that data comes back, or does not ask, does not fill out a survey, maybe fills it out under a tree in the shade somewhere, but you never know. But the data then is collected back to Dar es Salaam. The experts reconvene again. They send the Excel sheet to Washington, the Excel sheet to Dar es Salaam, a little bit to London, and 3 years later, you'll know how many people went to school. By the time, that of course, my question, how many people went to school, is completely irrelevant, because I want to know how many went. So then we do the same thing again. Every third or fifth year, we actually have data on this. And we forget this when we say we need this, we need that, and the Sustainable Development Goals with all their targets and indicators have made this grave mistake, I think, not asking what can we measure, but what we want to measure. And there is a very big mismatch between the two. That is, then I wanted to say something about evidence, policy-based evidence, or rather the opposite, which I observe, which is often policy-based evidence, where we often have, it's in the vogue that you should pay for results and you should only invest in what works. This is admirable in many senses if the data were pullable from the sky and you can just get the data. But if it is such that actually things change when we observe them, then we should be very careful about those things. In physics, they know about this Heisenberg principle, yeah? If you look at the particle, it changes. We should know that in social sciences, we have done that, you know, my theory is, I just came up with this morning, having my morning coffee, is that the worse your data is, the less you worry about data quality. And so then the better your data is, the more you worry about data quality. So there is this inverse. You know, when you if you don't measure data quality at all, your data is really, really bad. And so donors came up with an idea in Kenya, for instance, that they should not now anyhow just give money to the educational sector in Kenya, but they will give $1 per student that went to school. Yeah? And guess what? Numbers of people enrolled in Kenya went up dramatically, yeah, according to administrative data. But if they did a survey, when they actually got that survey and compared it, they find out that actually the number of people saying I went to school didn't change during that period, only changed in the reported data that each school reports. And the lesson is that we still don't know whether the program worked. We don't know, so the best thing is to say I don't know. The only thing we know is this, and that is now that Kenyans do not any longer know how many people go to school. So you had the only thing you had was a negative effect on information. So I think that's also we have to think about. We are very bad in development, and I think one of the things we really need innovation in development on is to think carefully and theoretically sometimes about what kind of numbers do we use, how does these things change. What's the problem of thinking about development as freedom and having something as far off base as the Human Development Index and so forth and so forth? Those are the kind of questions I think we should be paying attention to.
Wow, wonderful, thank you. So there's a lot to chew on here. I think what I'd like to do now is to try to extract some sort of common elements among all of their comments, turn them into questions, and then throw them back at you guys to sort of chew on a little bit longer. The first one is this that comes to mind for me, is that there's I detect a clear divide implicit in all your comments between researchers and scholars and experts who are very well attuned to uncertainty, to the challenges of data collection and measurement, to these deep epistemological and even ontological questions that have been raised about sort of what we want to measure and what we should measure, versus the policymaker, who wants certainty, who wants clarity, versus the journalist who wants the number that they can just sort of tack in the lead of their article to make clear, so forth and so on. I remember there's a famous quote from President Truman who said all he ever wanted in terms of advice was a one-handed economist, because he was so sick and tired of the economists who would say, well, on the one hand, you can do this, but on the other hand, we don't really have the data and we don't know, so forth and so on. And so what I want to ask you is this. Given that we are really well attuned to uncertainty, to the difficulties and challenges of measuring and these important value conversations that we like to have, but so rarely policymakers either don't have the time or don't feel they have the mandate to have, how should we go about communicating and making clear that uncertainty and encouraging policymakers to sort of fold that into the way in which they approach coming about solutions to discrete problems as they identify?
Can I disagree with you first?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So I think that's about half of the concern or the constraint. I think the other half is basically the opposite, which is, from what I've seen, it's research is, there's a significant lag between what is actually sort of unfolding on the ground that you're dealing with. The situation is changing, and because of the constraints of research, including the expectation that everything is sort of methodologically tight and you can test and pre-test and do a lot of that, it's very hard to respond to what is happening right now, in Manila, right? And so part of it, I think, is there's a lag, and that research is actually behind, sometimes by several years, what's really unfolding. So, and then policymakers are stuck. So what I see is policymakers are stuck because they have to make programs and they have to make decisions, really, really important, particularly very fine, detailed decisions, like do we have 6,000 people or do we have 3,000 people? Do we target, in the entrepreneurship area, do we target businesses that have been around for 3 years, or do we target startups? Those are questions that we as researchers, at least in that area, really haven't been able to answer. And in part it's because the policy questions and the sort of on the ground reality are changing, and then we get here, and then they've changed, and then we get here, right? So I think that's the other side of the.
Yeah, I think that one of the messages I would give is that we need to kind of embrace some of the messiness again, and realize that particularly what social scientists are really good at is figuring out why certain institutions are creating certain kinds of information and so forth, and not to try to make it look like science. And that we always would like to you're interested in health policy delivery, so then therefore you would like to get some very objective measure of that, so you would like it as extricated from the practice of delivering health as far as possible, because then it's objective. But then you generate information that is useless, because it's on a level in which the doctor can't use it, or the Ministry of Health and so forth. So get to the very precise level. So you need to think about, when you do development interventions in general, but particularly measurement, but in general, you need to think about feedback loops. So whether because knowledge is important for good policy, we know that. So when you are intervening in the policy process, particularly measurement process, is what kind of information am I providing? Is this kind of information going to be useful for writing reports at the World Bank? Or is it going to be useful for targeting poor households in Cape Town? And I would argue that we are investing way too much on our energy on figuring out whether it's 982 million people who have $1.92, that's $1.92 now. Actually, the main economist, one of the guys at the team wanted to actually be 1.92008, because that would be actually correct. But then Barsu actually said, no, I think we'll stick with 1.92. That's exact enough. But I mean, so we get that number very, very precisely, but we don't think about how that feeds in. And another thing I think is kind of counterintuitive is that we have this idea that if you're serious about something and you want to improve something, you need to measure it. Yeah, so that's like become a truism to the extent that I think it kind of ruins some of the things we're trying to do, because it's not like you measure everything you treasure. It actually is the opposite. So think about when we do admissions of students. We're happy to do admissions of bachelor students at GPA using numbers, because they're low-value students. They're not that expensive. We get many of them. We're going to fail a few of them. Doesn't matter that much. Master students, we'll ask them to read like 1/2 a page of something. It's basically a test whether you're able to attach a text to an email, but it's there. But then if it's a PhD, we are asking for a 6-page proposal. We're going to read stuff, because now we're investing $1 million. And if we're faculty, we'll fly them in. And so fly them in, we might even give them a beer just to see whether they combust in some way. And because getting those hiring decisions are so important. You wouldn't dream of just saying 3.2, that will do it. And so actually some of the things that we rely on such numbers to make like important development decisions should tell you one thing and one thing only. We don't care about this decision that much. We don't have time to get the proper information, so we're going to use this and pretend it as if it is good enough. And that's important to think about.
You just gave away the game for all the students in the audience.
No, I wasn't supposed to say that.
Listen, I think policymakers are wise to the fact that typically the data that they presented is not that great. And it's not a problem only in developing countries. The U.S. GDP keeps being revised. All the U.S. statistics get revised all the time. It is actually currently in the profession a big debate as to whether there's not a major mismeasurement problem in current GDP statistics in the U.S. related to the so-called fourth industrial revolution. You hear everywhere people talking about the robots and fourth industrial revolution, and you don't see any of that in the statistics. Actually, it's the opposite. When you look at the statistics, the real problem is not the revolution, technological revolution. The real question is how come the U.S. economy is not any longer generating productivity gains. So exactly the opposite. So there's a debate. So these numbers will always change in the best of circumstances. It's important for people who do not get their hands deep into the data to know that. No number is so certain that even in this country. So it's important when you're not a technician of the field. Don't believe either when the number is too precise. At the beginning of the year, the Chinese Communist Party announced that the growth rate target for GDP in China would be 6.7%. The third quarter estimate for the estimate for third quarter GDP was released the day before the party congress in October. Guess what the number was? 6.7. Not 6.6, not 6.8, 6.7. Maybe. But it's also important that to understand that not only that we're dealing in a world of second best, and often relying on a good proxy. We understand GDP is not welfare, but it's not too far, and God knows how you're going to measure this. so it's a good starting point. Also, you may want to improve GDP statistics, but don't make sure that you don't make a bad situation worse by adding all sort of extraneous dimensions. You would like GDP to measure environmental amenities, ecosystem service, blah, blah, blah. These are all going to be imputed numbers, speculations that you're going to add to something that is already shaky. Chances are you're not going to improve the quality of the data. It's going to deteriorate. So you got to be realistic in what and you need not think that put all your eggs in the same basket. And don't think that you go beyond an approximation. Same thing for poverty. I think any reasonable person understands that poverty is not one person, $1 or $1.95 a day, and everybody understands that. I mean, poverty is multidimensional. It's deprivation of capabilities. I understand that, but how do you measure that? So it's a good proxy. 195, it's a good proxy. But when you hear people saying this year 200 million or this decade 200 million people have grown out of poverty, just put some caveats around that number, because that is not so scientific. You're just approximating something. You're not measuring poverty per se.
So one of the goals of the Tobias Center is to try to provide some clarity about the way in which we think about and use metrics in international development. And so with that in mind, I'd be interested to hear each of you reflect on what you think important principles or even values should be for researchers such as those working with the Tobias Center, should be in terms of how they go about perhaps collecting data and creating their own data sets, or in the way in which they study and analyze metrics as part of the development process.
Well, I already talked to it a little bit with regards to what kind of feedback loops you're creating. So whether your work, in what sense, what kind of new information is it going to generate? Does it distort information or so forth? But I think also there is a big, among students and scholars and journalists and experts and readers of books, a huge need for educating themselves about, you know, where does this data come from, and trying to get some tools and skills about how to navigate the universe of data. So in the different ways, I mean, it's, of course, methods. It's part of methods. How do you get to know stuff? But we somehow don't have that critical lens on statistics. So when you download a number at the World Bank, or you read in the newspaper 800 million are poor or so forth, you need to ask yourself, just like a journalist would do, who made this observation? Under what conditions was this observation made? And is there any reason to think that this number is biased? And then that's kind of a sense I think is important in all fields of social science, but I think maybe in the study of development it is even it's a very, I mean, this is a way that I think the study of development has a bigger lesson for social science in general. So I think that we're all dealing with, as I said, the kind of issue from going from theoretical definitions and then counting things and categorizing and saying we have 9 of these and 12 of those. That's what we do in social science. But when we do development, often the categories are invented one place and then travel to another place, and sometimes they don't travel very well. Unemployment is one of them. And it's, you know, you can all come up with what's the best way of defining or asking someone, are you employed in Nigeria? And then come up with a sensible way of measuring unemployment, which has factually the same kind of meaning that it would be if you did the same survey in Norway. It's not possible. But that's one of the things we just have to live with. But I think we need more education on that field. And therefore, as well, as I told, one thing is the way the categories travel, the other one is statistical capacity being lower and so forth. As I mentioned, Tanzania, they don't have that number directly, readily, and so forth. So I think in that sense, I think the study of development can actually make those contrasts and those tensions very clear, and then in that way enlighten about, for instance, debates about why we don't measure productivity growth well in the US currently, and whether GDP is actually a good equivalent for welfare and so forth.
So I think 2 things for me. The first is that context is really important, and so some of these more objective data sets are very useful, but we also, I think, want to weigh a couple of different types of metrics, which are basically proxies, right? So and I'll give you an example, if you're looking at firm growth, it really depends on what country and what part of the world you're in, and that's how you interpret your metric. So if you're looking at, for example, sales growth, and you're using a data set that has listed firms, then you're probably going to get a pretty good number. But if you're using firms that aren't listed, then there are incentives in some countries to underreport sales, right? And I mean, we can all imagine the reasons for that. So looking at sales growth in a survey of informal firms in Mexico and a survey of, say, firms in Indianapolis, you're going to get very different accuracy when you're looking at that. When you look at job creation, you want the context of the industry that you're in, because some industries that are tech-based and that you see a lot of basically sort of equipment and machine-based production will show you low job numbers, right? But that doesn't actually mean that they are poor performers or that they aren't good industries to be interested in. And so in that sense, I think context matters a lot, and being aware of that and being really open about how context matters, particularly when it makes the data fuzzier, is really important. In a lot of low-income countries, in particular, corruption really obscures what we're looking at, and the data doesn't always capture that. And so related to that, I think are 2 things. One is qualitative and quantitative data, particularly when training students, are both really crucial. With the exception of, not with the exception, but some types of quantitative data will allow you to assign causality, will allow you to actually capture the impact of something. But a lot of our quantitative data sets are descriptive, so they sort of capture what's going on, and that's where qualitative data becomes really important, because that lets you dig deeper and understand the forces that are at work. So we may see that in 1985, 6,000 firms closed in a country. And just looking at that data doesn't actually tell us why. It could be that in 1964 there was a huge uptick in the economy, and what we see in some countries is that new business creation actually may slow down when the economy grows, because there are better paid jobs in the labor market, and so a lot of people then don't have to start companies or become self-employed out of necessity. That's counterintuitive to our thinking, because we traditionally assign more business startups with a better economy. So qualitative research actually helps you understand what happened. You talk to people, you get some context that really fleshes out what we see in the numbers trend. So I think it's important not to lose that. And then, you know, the third point, I think particularly is when dealing with student training, is in in being really sort of aware of the technical needs and the scale and the scope of good data. So you want to go really deep. You know, we want to know in Mumbai exactly what is happening, but we also want an expansive eye on what's happening around the rest of the country, because if the trend is similar to other cities, it's not so strange. If the trend is different from other cities, then we stop and we ask why. So, and that's expensive. And so for the Tobias Center and anyone else, any other center doing research, particularly in the international context, it's extremely expensive, and the scale of data that we really want, ideally, is massive. And so often we're going to be making trade-offs to get information that we can use versus information that we really, really, really want and we ideally would like to have.
My hunch is that there's actually more data out there than is actually exploited, and that the priority is to actually use this data and research on the data that is already out there and that has been generated at great expense of resources. It's indeed, for me, in my career, it has been a disappointment that in the context of the Arab Spring, we at the World Bank put a lot of emphasis, put a lot of maybe pressure on the governments in the region to be more open in allowing people to access data. Many of these countries, statistical data regarded as military secrets, and we thought that it was important in the context of the creation of open societies that the researchers, regular citizens would have better access to data, and that would stimulate a greater public policy debate. And we've made some progress, I must say, in getting this data to be published. Where we've made less progress is getting researchers and the policymakers to actually use them. And I think it's where the lag is now. I don't know exactly why that is. I suspect that part of it is something that can be perhaps addressed by centers like this one, by faculty, there's an infatuation with US academia. So even in the developing countries, what they want to write a paper about something that's going to be published in an American journal or about a topic that the American researchers have, and the American researchers do not necessarily reciprocate the the courtesy of getting to understand, getting their hands dirty on what's really motivating or the question is really. And I think it's a pity. So if I could encourage something, is to encourage the students, encourage the faculty to go out there and research, because it is a great public service that is currently underperformed.
Great, thank you. So we have about 15 minutes left, and at this point I'd like to turn it over to the audience for any questions they have for our guests. Joe? Wait for the microphone.
Hi, thank you. Very interesting topic. Again, I'm Joe Ryan now with SPIA, formerly with USAID, and I have one question about measuring development assistance and one question about measuring development. The thing about measuring development assistance I want to ask about stems from the fact that, speaking of the US, Americans don't get to see development assistance, generally speaking. They don't know what it is. So a measurement that describes it, that represents it, is that much more difficult. And sometimes I think of approaching, and I want to ask, of approaching the question of measuring it from the point of, or using a description of something we know what it is, and moving from that to measuring and describing this development assistance thing that people, the public doesn't know what it is, doesn't see it. So frequently I do this in class. I say, let's describe a car. Everybody knows what a car is. And I propose a description. I say, what do you think of a description or a metric of a car as a check I send to my Ford dealership in Bloomington every month? And people usually think that's a wretched description of an automobile. They all know what an automobile is, and that isn't it. Now, for development assistance, how do we describe it? Well, we describe it as the appropriations of budgetary funds for the costs of development assistance. Don't get me wrong, the Washington, D.C. appropriation process is terribly important. Is it a good measure of development assistance? Is it a good description of development assistance? My question on measuring development is, in American English, the word development can refer to a state or a process. And I think we're mostly thinking in terms of a state rather than a process in the metrics we've been talking about. You can get different answers, however, depending on whether you're thinking of measuring a state or a process. Was the United States economy developed in 1870? Its income level relative to today was, again, wretched, very poor. On the other hand, it was at the technical frontier of the world economies. It demonstrated it had the capacity for economic progress. From that point of view, it's as developed as you could get. But was it as rich as you could get? No. So the state and the process are different. One proposal, if you wanted to think about measuring the development process, would be measuring the capacity to achieve progress. And an example would be, well, first, GDP doesn't refer to that at all. One way to measure that might be, and I ask you what you think of it, the quality of professional education in the 20 most important technical and managerial fields that you would choose for managing an emerging market economy. That would be a measure of potentially your capacity to develop those sectors. Okay? But it's wholly different than what I think we usually talk about. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that development assistance is a classic example. So when we define as ODA, and it's a classic kind of example when the indicator approximately takes over the phenomena that it was purporting to measure. It's a classic kind of case. So you're actually thinking about the broader thing that you're helping or assisting or making conditions favorable to. But you end up, okay, so how are we going to do this? Well, it's ODA, and it's 0.7% of GDP. And then that becomes the game. So Norway is not trying to help the world anymore. We're just trying to get above 0.7% of GDP. And we fudge the numbers by saying, oh, we use money on refugees in our country, that's ODA, and so forth. I'm not saying Norway is not doing that, but it's a classic kind of law of measurement. You end up, students are supposed to become students of history, are supposed to become good historians, but they are actually just trying to get a good grade in history. And it's usually, if your syllabus is well defined, there is a close coming together of those things, that getting an A in history is close to being a good historian. But it's not always. And in particular, I think we can make the case that doing development is not well measured by ODA or the percentage of GDP there. So the other question about process and state, I think, is a huge topic. It does vary. So, in all kinds of measurement, whatever you do, it's going to be, things are going to have temporal and spatial limitations. And so you'll have to change them at the time. The work of economic historians is always trying to say, like, this, let's keep this thing constant and let's watch it across time and space. GDP is one of those tools. Doesn't always work.
I'll just point out that so ODA is just one of the many mechanisms now, and so there's a lot of privately driven activity, there's a lot of philanthropic activity, there's much more than just the sort of traditional bilateral approach. So I agree with you. I think ODA is a problem, but I think we can probably look at other types of trends as well and tell the story maybe better that way. So.
And I'm also reminded of the invocation of Albert Hirschman from yesterday, right? And Hirschman argued, there may be a development project that seeks to build a dam in a particular country, and there may be a certain set of metrics surrounding how we know if that dam building project meets its particular metrics. But along the way, the developers in the country, people may end up building a factory to help do this and moving people over there to help do that. And in that way, there's these things that Hirschman would argue are development that sort of happen in the process of pursuing this project that may not come up in that final metric, right? And so that's sort of incumbent upon the researchers and the project managers to find a way to sort of grasp and measure all that activity that may not relate to the sort of metrics you had in mind when you started, right? Or may have sort of driven the policy in the first place. But nonetheless reflect things that happened in the world, right? And may have reshaped the way in which people live their lives. Let's get a few other questions. I see a couple hands over there. Let's go with the young woman and then the fellow in the dark blazing.
Hi, my name is Karis, and I'm a senior here at SGIS. And so I have a question kind of about how we can maybe apply this. I know as a student I am, doing assignments for class and that sort of thing, but also transitioning into, doing reports for other sorts of things and acknowledging that the data that we have available is not necessarily the most accurate representation of what is actually happening. And so is it really that we just need to be acknowledging that there is error there, that what we could be presenting is incorrect based on inaccurate data, or is there some sort of way we need to be thinking about reforming how we make policy on a broader scale to account for lacking data? And then my other question has to do, is error just inherent, or can we kind of reframe the way we talk about policy? And then we have also been talking a lot about doing things from the ground up during this conference. So I'm wondering how that might fit into our question about data here. We've been talking about GDP, which is a very macro level data, but how maybe scaling from the ground up might be helpful there.
I think as students, as enlightened citizens, it's your duty to do as good a job as you can, and then try to be, if you think the data is good, then say it. If you think the data is not so good, then please say so too. And it's also, it's a natural thing. So the way we do practice in the classroom or in the papers or at the World Bank and so forth will affect how the world we live around. So we're very concerned about how we talk about people and how we classify people, because we think we'll have an impact about the society we live in. So we should also be very careful about how we talk about and measure poverty. Yeah? So if you think that $1.92 is a good approximation of poverty, then that's so. But I think there is also, the more people who think equate poverty with 1.92 and what actually lose track of that multidimensional way we approached it in the 1990s. In the 1990s, the World Bank came up with this report saying whose reality counts, which is the radical idea that you'll ask the poor people what poverty is. But then, and that was beautiful, but then we came into the Millennium Development Goals, and then we said, okay, but we got to measure this. We can't just have it floating around. We can't just be asking people what poverty is. It's got to be 1.25, it was then, 1.25. And then therefore, so for every student paper, when you forget that when you're saying 1.25, you're using a proxy, you're not talking about poverty, it is actually not measurable, and that actually when you're addressing in your essay is something bigger than 1.25. Well, yeah, so I think that it's very important to keep doing that job really well. And I think also, let's not make the mistake of thinking that data equals numbers. So data is what is given. So most of the numbers in the World Bank data is actually not data. They're not given, they're made up. So So data is observations. You need to flatten the field. A judgment, an interview, a statement is as valuable as 3.2. And you both need to be critically engaged. And I think the more students to do that well and ask, who made the observation, under what conditions, and so forth, both of numbers and opinions, the better we'll do in the future.
I'll offer one optimistic thought, which is you're not actually constrained by a lot of the traditional data sources. Certainly not even, I did my PhD more than 10 years ago, but a lot of the data sources that I was using even then aren't really the best ones anymore. And so, and particularly with technology and with sort of the equalization of data access with technology, you have so many more options, and I think that's just going to continue. So Twitter, if you can analyze Twitter, that is actually a much better source of data on some trends than government-issued data, right? Or than other data. So when you look at the types of data that are available now, it's getting better and better every day. And also don't hesitate to be creative. Don't use the number of cars in a country to proxy for firm starts, but you can be pretty creative, and there's a lot there. I think he's totally right when he says there's a lot of data that's there and that's just not applied in a certain way to proxy for something. So that and technology for data access are two things that I think are going to make it just much better for you than it was even 10 years ago, and 10 years from now, just even that much better.
Well, fully agree. So be careful with data, but use them. But use them carefully and with honesty. Do your statistics, do your econometrics. There's all kinds of method to, and just to have to deal with the existence of errors in the data. And it's not the only field. My son works in brain imagery. It's all about correcting for errors. You get some vague cloud of thing you don't know what it is, and you try to get to. It's the same in other fields. So you don't have to be shy. The world is like this. Second point is data is not the only source of policy making. That is a technocratic approach. Don't be wedded to it. The greatest source of policy making is through the political processes. And that's why it is so important to expand the capacity of people, to the participation of people, to the way they can make an intelligent contribution to that debate. It's not that you, as the technocrat, the student, etc., has found the right solution. It's how you interact and how this policy debate can mature in society. That is a very important dimension of development, as I was trying to make in my earlier remarks.
Great. So one final question.
Thank you all for this fantastic conference and panel. As I was sitting here listening to all of you, it occurred to me that maybe one of the themes, maybe the theme of this conference is actually how to tell the right story, or how to tell a story. Because we are looking at the importance of data, of research, of metrics, of all of these things, and debating, with the last question, talking about the role of, are there errors, and how do we portray those things? So I wanted to ask all of you, any of you, what you thought about that idea of the necessity of utilizing perhaps creative nonfiction to understand all of the complexity of what we're looking at, and specifically within our current political climate.
I think a lot of, one thing is, fiction as a source of knowledge and as a prism to get used as analysis, but I think also storytelling is central. I think that, so the humans understand numbers, we understand models, and we understand stories. Yeah? And they travel fast. Numbers travel very fast. Models are also very easy to understand. Supply and demand curves And then there is stories. And so I think that these are all ways in which we can impact policy and so forth like that. So I think that telling a compelling story is, and you sometimes, you read a piece, like for instance, I think Why Nations Fail is a good example of this. It's not very compelling, the evidence nor the theory to my mind, but it's a compelling story. And I think that's why it's so widely read as well. It's like all makes sense now, okay? Make this simple, North Korea is poor, South Korea isn't. Aha, it must be institutions. And these are, and then there's all this nitty-gritty of actually sorting out Niger and Nigeria and Mali and all the settled. That forget about the data being wrong. Most of the times, we use numbers for, just like drunk men use light posts for support, not enlightenment. And that is to support the story you're telling there to begin with. So start with the story, find the numbers. There you go.
If you want to follow the drunk man on the night post story.
I got another drunk man analog.
You beat me to it. to the lamppost. No, I think storytelling, narratives are very important. Actually, it's funny, it was a big theme in last year's annual conference of the American Economic Association. That was actually the theme of the chairman's address. So it's a good read, so go to it. I think it's something that is important. Coming out of this conference, of this group, is to come out with a story that development has been an amazing success. I've heard all the frustration about this project thing, etc. But development as a general proposition has been an amazing success, and it has been an amazing success of the countries themselves and of the multilateral spirit that has supported it. When I started to work in the early 80s, the poverty rate, however measured,
wasn't measured.
Well, it's been measured backwards, but however measured was 50%. 50% of the world population, however measured, was living under 1% a day. The equivalent number is now 10%. That is amazing. That is particularly amazing because the world population has doubled in the meantime. And the income per capita has increased for each of these to twice as many citizens of the planet, has increased by 2/3. Over the period of where I've been working, my active career, isn't that amazing? And isn't that something that needs to be projected? I mean, you want to tell a story, that has to be the story, that it's working. It's working, and we're part of it. I think it's the best story you can tell.
Yeah, I think there's a huge role for this. And so you hear again and again, just tell me what to do. Don't use words like regression or R-square or chi-square or time series. And so I think, especially when we're trying to translate the value or, the key content, then there's a huge role for that for the audiences that are going to be using it in particular.
Well, wonderful. I think that's a nice conversation to end on. So please join me in thanking our panelists. And I'd like to encourage and invite everyone in this room to continue sharing stories and working on our narratives. So perhaps as we walk out, we could give all of ourselves a round of applause. Our distinguished keynote speaker, Senator Richard Lugar, and of course, Randall and Deborah Tobias, whose generous gift made this all possible. So thank you both.